what happened then? VCs.
Yeah, VCs, it's your fault.
Data build tool, or DBT. Perhaps you've heard of it, perhaps you haven't if you've been sleeping under a rock for the last 2 years.
It's a company called DBT, pioneered this sort of movement of analytics engineering.
We've always cared about getting more humans involved in the process of analytics engineering. You get to a meeting and somebody says revenue is this and somebody else says no, revenue is this. And so the conversation becomes about the numbers instead of the business. Too many disparate sources of truth. The semantic layer, in the same way that like cloud data platform centralizes data so you can all use the same data.
Recently, it ended up raising $222 million in funding.
We waited a long time to raise any venture funding at all. We had companies using the product before we raised a single cent. If you haven't adapted to cloud in the data space today, you just probably don't exist anymore.
Hey, Tristan, how are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so this is going to be pretty much unscripted. You and I were exchanging emails about catching up and sort of geeking out about the modern data stack, and then I think like you had the wonderful idea of saying, hey, maybe we should record this, which was a brilliant idea.
Well, so I communicated it poorly. I thought I was inviting you onto my podcast, and it turns out that, anyway, here we are. I'm excited to be talking.
Yeah, it's such a 2024 conversation, right, where it's sort of unclear whether that's your podcast or my podcast. It's just like too many podcasts, or maybe the right number of podcasts. So we were going to talk about the modern data stack for this conversation you and I were going to have. And then as part of your thinking, you published this really interesting, very thoughtful write-up, as always, called Is the Modern Data Stack Still a Useful Idea? That people can Google, and then we'll put it in the show notes as well. So I'd love for this to be the core of the conversation. And by the way, I think that's really super interesting that of all people, you would be asking the question. So look, for what it's worth, is something I've been thinking about as well for a little while. And as people that listen to this may know, I do this annual landscape of the data and AI industry, and as part of that, I have a write-up. And part of the theme in 2023 was the modern data stack under pressure. But in some ways, of course, I'm an investor, but in some ways, I'm an impartial observer. But you, of all people, you've been one of the key architects of the concept, and it's very much a promoter and central piece of it. So I love the idea that you would ask the question in the first place. So maybe let's start with the concept of the modern data stack itself. Is that a functional thing of products working together? Is that a marketing concept? Is that an industry alliance? How do you think about it?
I won't say that I coined the term modern data stack. I will say that I think I was a part of the community that started using that term, and I did some of the writing and thinking that led to its popularity. And it became a thing that people frequently said in the 2016 through 2019 period. The way that I experienced it was that I had a decade plus data career prior to 2012. And that data career felt very different to my data career post 2012. And the big dividing line there for me was Redshift, and not specifically Redshift, because there have now been other databases that have come out that are like Redshift, but it is the year that the cloud first came for analytics. And the cloud really changes a lot about how you build an analytics product. It changes a lot about how you, as a practitioner, want to go about the work that you do. There's just a lot of assumptions that when you kind of start off, baking the cloud in, you have to kind of reevaluate them. And so in 2016, I was a consultant. I helped people implement, quote unquote, the modern data stack. And at that point in time, it really meant something. I had a strong preference to use tools like Mode or Looker over a tool like Tableau, because Tableau was pre-cloud, and it assumed that you were going to be able to Now, it did have some capability to like write SQL, but it mostly assumed that you were going to be able to download all the data that you needed to operate on into your local cache, and then it did most of its calculations in memory. And in the cloud world, people started doing analytics on top of clickstream data, behavioral data, and that just like didn't make any sense in Tableau's model of the world. And so tools like Looker and Mode and others that kind of pushed all the compute. I mean, it was cheaper to build a product like that because these tools didn't have to build the caching layer, but it also meant like you could do a lot more because you were relying on the database to do more. Anyway, that's where things kind of started out, and since 2019, I think things have evolved from there. But I do want to kind of defend the idea that when people started using the term modern data stack, there was a there, like Fivetran, DBT, Mode, Looker, et cetera. These are tools that were built around an idea of how data technology should work, and it was and is a good idea.
And then what happened in 2020 and 2021, which, I think in your piece you talk about the memification of the modern data stack. It sort of feels like those were the years when it happened. So what happened then? VCs.
Yeah, VCs. It's your fault. Well, it just, I think it became clear to enough people, both investors and practitioners and even enterprise buyers, that there was something going on here. And I think that the Snowflake IPO was a big part of this. I mean, the biggest enterprise software IPO of all time. And all of a sudden that unlocks, I mean, it creates a huge marketing event for this technology ecosystem broadly. But it means that all of a sudden enterprise buyers take this wave seriously in a way that they hadn't before. And as a result of that, there was increased demand from buyers and there was increased interest from investors. And all of a sudden now, I mean, I don't know your portfolio particularly intimately, but my guess is that you probably felt some need also to get exposure to the overall like data stack trend. And when you have that belief from the VC side, then it creates, it was very common for many early stage VCs to actually go out into big tech companies and find people who like worked on X or Y or Z modern data stack type problem.
Especially open source, right? Especially open source.
Yes, and then they would just like pull them out and say like, we'll give you $5 million, go make this. And there were too many companies created too quickly. And I think that created some, I don't know, like unpleasantness in the mouth of the practitioners that had been using this term for a little while. They felt like, this is my term. And now they saw all these other people and it became a marketing buzzword.
So it was too much of a good thing, basically. I mean, I look certainly from my perspective as a VC, who had been passionate about that space for a number of years before that whole thing happened. It did feel very excessive. It was kind of weird in some ways that data infrastructure, which I love and obviously you love as well, but ultimately it's a pretty geeky thing. That like suddenly became like a household, name and a category that like everybody would rush in. But it did feel like in the wake of the Snowflake IPO, you had a bunch of categories that were crowded overnight, where suddenly you went from one company to like 8 companies or sometimes 15.
I mean, I don't like to get too deep into the specifics because people can feel like you're bad mouthing them in public. But I will say that I talked to a data catalog vendor a little while ago, and they said, we're the number 6 data catalog. And I was just like, that's not a great place to be in. That's too many data catalogs. Anyway, there's 2 reasons that I have been thinking a lot about this. One is that my post, I said I don't think the modern data stack is a useful idea anymore, and the main thing there is that it's not technically descriptive of anything anymore, because what I was just saying about Tableau isn't true anymore. It was true in 2016, but if you haven't adapted to cloud in the data space today, you just probably don't exist anymore. Now, maybe there's some like legacy big enterprise software type stuff that is still operating in the bowels of many companies that will kind of it'll have a half-life, but it'll never really die. But there's just no world in which Tableau doesn't have a good Snowflake integration, and it's still a viable tool. And in fact, they have gone through this journey just like everybody else has gone through this journey. And so now the term that was used to describe this difference of pre-cloud and post-cloud, it's not that useful anymore because everybody's post-cloud. I mean, we're 8 years on here. But the other thing that I think is very interesting is that there's this idea around the modern data stack. It is a stack. It is many different tools that are all best of breed in the things that they do, and they all you buy them together, and they work together, and they use SQL as a standard operating interface, and that's how you should be doing analytics work. Is that you should be buying 7, 8, 9, 10 different products and integrating them all together, and that stopped being true also because in the macro environment that we're operating in, buyers have less patience for that. They just don't want to operate in that way. That's not to say that there isn't still a stack. Like, I don't believe that we're going back to Oracle and Microsoft in 2000 and everybody's just going to buy all their stuff from one vendor. If you say, I want a modern data platform as a CDO, like the right answer is not go out and buy 9 different products and integrate them together. And that really changes the way that founders in this space have been operating, because we had all kind of developed this way of like, we all had our swim lanes, we had partnerships, we like went to market kind of together as a team. And that's still true to a certain extent, but it's less true than it was 2 years ago.
Those are very interesting things in what you just said. But like one key question is that leaving aside what buyers are able to afford, not afford, both in terms of budget and time, they would allocate to stitching tools together. From a functional standpoint, is the idea of the modern data stack as fresh as ever? Or are there emerging ways of doing things completely differently? Because it seems to me, ultimately, if you're going to do analytics, you still need to get data from somewhere, and you need to transform it somewhere, you need to analyze it somewhere, and something needs to come out, which seems to support this idea of like an assembly line. But is there like a different way of doing things?
No, yeah. So this is, you mentioned that it's funny that I wrote this and not somebody else. And maybe our incentives as a company are for the modern data stack to be the buzziest of buzzwords forever. I don't know. But in writing this post, I tried to thread the needle of saying the way we talk about this, the terms that we use maybe need to change, but that's not to say that the workflow, the methodology, the tooling is in any way outdated. So I'm sure that many different things have gone through this wave, but it makes me think of Agile in like 2008. I mean, freaking everybody was talking about Agile. Everyone was so excited about it. You went to get your Scrum Master certification, all this stuff. Like, all that stuff is still very relevant. Like, people still run teams on Agile. It's but it doesn't like blow up the internet anymore. It's just an accepted way that we do work in software engineering. And I feel the same way about like one of the kind of trends inside of this is the transition from ETL, extract, transform, load, to ELT, extract, load, and transform. And that seems to anyone who's not in data that might not seem like a big thing, but in fact, it's like a really significant transition in the way that data work is done. And I think that will just be true forever. Like, and that's not going anywhere. And so that means that companies like us and companies like Fivetran that are big parts of that, we're not going anywhere. So this, to me, I think that my big conclusion is I sent an email to our product marketing, our head of product marketing. I was like, hey, can we just say the analytics stack? Like, this is a set of technologies that works together to do analytics. And it kind of tries to get away from the buzzwordy nature of the modern data stack term.
But then, so if you believe that the functional need remains and is, as strong as ever, and then we're saying that what we're hearing from the market is that people just don't want or cannot afford having like a bunch of different tools that they stitch together. Then what happens? So you mentioned, we're not going to all go back to Microsoft, but if you look at players like the key sort of central repositories like the Snowflakes and the Databricks, like there seems to be a clear path to expansion to like different functional parts. So if you look at Databricks, I think last year or like whenever that was, they announced a bunch of like different things, data catalogs and data governance and all of this. Which look, you could argue whether that's part of the very precise definition of the modern data stack or not. But this is clear path to expansion from a functional standpoint. So are we going toward a world where people will get most of their tooling from a small number of vendors, or what do you think is going to happen?
So yeah, this is the question. This is like my job and George's job at Fivetran and Ali's job and Frank's. This is like the thing that people are trying to figure out and kind of elbow each other around right now. I mean, really, kind of AWS and Azure and Google kind of sit at the top of this food chain, and then people like me and George just get to figure out what everybody else above us is doing. But here's some things that I would guess. My guess is that if you sell compute and storage, most of your money is going to come from selling compute and storage, because it's a great business model. It's all 5 of those companies. It's their primary business model, and it's been funny to navigate the partnership there, because they have actually my read. It's not like I know the minds of the folks at Snowflake or Databricks so clearly, but like my read is that people like us, people like Fivetran, while we are critical to their success as platforms because we drive a ton of consumption, they don't actually really care about the dollars that we make as businesses, because they're so tiny relative to the like actual business of compute and storage. The way that you, like when you talk to the folks at the hyperscalers, they will say, we're like making sure that our solution like covers all these different areas, but it's mostly not because we want to compete in these areas. It's mostly because people come to us with RFPs and we need to be able to check all these boxes. But like if the customer has a preference to use, X or Y independent product, I mean, they've been navigating this stuff with, Elastic or Confluent or whatever for a long time now. But if their customer comes to them with a preference for a best of breed product, they're like, hell yeah, because guess what? They're all still running on top of that same cloud infrastructure, driving that same, compute and storage.
So what do you think happens to all the companies in the space? So like, we're just saying a massive wave of VC investment and like everybody overnight becoming a huge fan of data infrastructure and, creating little categories. So are we heading to a wave of consolidation of some sort? And if so, without, pointing fingers or naming names necessarily, although if you want to do that, You were welcome. But are there specific categories? You mentioned data catalogs. One category that's interesting to me from what it means at an industry level is reverse ETL, which is sort of thing that came up and then seems to like overnight, got super crowded and super funded, and then fast forward to today, a lot of those companies are sort of becoming customer data platforms, not reverse ETL. So there's like this whole evolution. So what happens going forward, and two, which categories are more at risk?
Yeah, are you involved in any of the reverse ETL companies?
I'm not. I'm an investor in a company called ActionIQ, which is a customer data platform. But regardless of whether I'm involved or not,
Sure.
please feel free.
No, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because that was going to be one of the things that I said. I think one of the potential evolution pathways is for people that were originally companies that were originally selling to data buyers to instead sell to a different buyer. And so you've got, and reverse ETL is like I think a very good example of this. It turns out that the value of a reverse ETL tool does not accrue to the central data team. It accrues primarily to sales and marketing teams who get the data. So I think there's a lot of those companies that are much more focused on them, which on selling to sales and marketing buyers. And that means that just from this ecosystem standpoint that we were talking about before, we and they are no longer talking to the same buyers. We don't have the same kind of marketing events. We just start to diverge, which is fine. Like ultimately, our incentives are for there to be more value created in the data warehouse ecosystem, but there's less like direct partnership activities to do there. There's other paths. I mean, there's the like direct acquisition path. I mean, we acquired a company about a year ago called Transform, broadened our solution.
It was a metric store company, right?
Yes. Yep. Their technology now powers the dbt Semantic Layer, which we launched in October. My guess is that there will be some more of that. The funny thing is, though, that I think a lot of modern data stack companies had to build, there's like the iceberg, which is 10% above the water and you can see it. And then there's 90% below the water. For a data company, the platform is the below the water part. And then the functionality that you build on that platform is the 10% at the top. And a lot of times, different companies in the space have already built their platform. And that ends up making acquisitions harder, because you're like, well, I could acquire this other company and get the 10% of their stuff above because anytime you acquire a company, you've got to combine platforms, which is a shit ton of work. So you could buy the 10% of the stuff that sits at top, or you could probably just build that yourself, and it might be faster and cheaper to do that. Anyway, so I don't know how much acquisition will happen, but I'm positive that there's going to be a lot of side-to-side kind of people trying to figure out if they can widen their swim lanes.
And the elephant in the room that we haven't spoken about yet is AI. We're talking about how things got crazy around data infrastructure and the modern data stack in 2020 and 2021, from a VC perspective, customer attention perspective, press perspective, and that seems to echo in some almost eerie ways what's happening in AI right now. So what do you make of it? Is AI a friend or foe for this whole set of companies?
Well, if what you were trying to do is maximize the multiple that your software company was trading at, then AI is the enemy, because all the multiple expansion has moved from modern data stack to AI. But honestly, from my perspective, that's a good thing. You can't build long-lasting progress on top of buzzy press ecosystems and high multiples. So I think that the analytics ecosystem is in a place where, after some kind of resetting over the past year or so, there is kind of sustained progress getting made. Practitioners are like seeing continued forward movement, regardless of what layer of the stack you're talking about. And then the question becomes, how can, just like cloud was a huge secular trend that this entire set of technologies was built on, AI is another huge secular trend. What do we do with it? And you could kind of ask that for all the different data workflows, and that's like way more time than we have here. But I'll tell you that owning the data transformation experience from end to end, from like code authoring to testing to execution to discovery, like owning that entire process gives us so many opportunities to inject AI in there. I mean, from the beginning with development, like it turns out that there are just some pretty straightforward unlocks on how to make authoring DBT code way more efficient. I mean, we've already got internal prototypes working of generate me a model that does this, or generate me tests for this model, or write documentation for. So we've got all of this stuff that is going to be making its way through at some point.
And those are your own models, or like how do you go about building those?
No, it turns out that the hard problem here is actually, I mean, there's enough SQL written in the world. There's enough even DBT code written in the world where just your standard foundation model will do this stuff pretty well, which will be interesting for us to figure out. Like, can we over time scale this stuff with lower cost, whatever? Like right now, you plug in GPT 3.5 and it's not as fast as you want, and it costs more than you want. But like something as stupidly simple as like insert formula, and you describe an English text to what you want the formula to do, and having it write the regex without you having to go to Stack Overflow and say, like, remind me how to do email splitting regex. It's just such a big performance accelerator. So I think analytics engineering is going to change meaningfully over the next 2 years. And beyond that, I have no idea what anything is going to look like. So I don't try to predict beyond that.
Yeah. And analytics engineering is like a big part of your overall positioning as a company. In fact, your blog and podcast is called the Analytics Engineering Podcast. So like spearheading and creating that profession is like a thing that you guys have done wonderfully well. But like, so just to double click on the point, you think analytics engineers become prompt engineers over time?
Well, the thing that one of the core beliefs about that we have about the profession is that data and software are not that different. And when you're building a production data system, you're building a production software system, which means that we should be taking lessons as a profession from things that software engineers often figured out decades ago. Now, in the case of AI, we're not so far behind because a lot of these capabilities have only existed for the past, a year or something. But I don't think that anyone believes that software engineers are going to go away. I think that they are going to get dramatically more efficient. So if you, there are so many things in when you try to express an idea as code that you don't have loaded up into your prefrontal cortex, right? Like, and that's, for a long time we've used Google and Stack Overflow and constant recompilation until you get a success message as kind of the workflow there. And that, I think, is like really what the future looks more like. Like, you express the thing that you're trying to accomplish, you go in there and you fiddle around with some of the bits that require proprietary knowledge that only lives in your brain. And then you ask the thing to repeatedly recompile itself and fix errors until it gets to a compilable state.
So that's one part of the discussion of the intersection of the modern data stack and AI, which is, okay, can AI, help you build superpowers to do data engineering better? Another part of the conversation is the modern data stack part of the emerging stack around generative AI? Are the things overlapping? Are they complementary? How do you think about it?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't think we have good words for this yet, but we're seeing it happen internally, and anecdotally, I'm hearing it happening at other companies too. One of the first places that we have invested from an AI perspective is making our support team more efficient. We don't have our customers interact directly with AI agents, but we have AI agents that are there to accelerate response times on the part of our support reps. And that has made a massive improvement in support. We primarily from an efficiency standpoint, it's not that previously we were giving terrible responses and now we give good responses. It's that we're now able to take a brand new support rep and ramp them up in half the time. We are also able to get response times down. And all of that relies on data that lives in our data lake, our data warehouse. dbt has kind of no awareness today that is happening. And so in some ways, you could say, well, the quote unquote modern data stack has nothing to do with this. But in fact, infrastructure is exactly as valuable as the business value that is created on top of that infrastructure. So to a certain extent, the fact that there are people developing AI use cases all over the place that dbt generated data is powering is very, very good for us.
Plus, ultimately, AI, especially enterprise AI, you want to bring in your data, right? So there's like this whole emergence of RAG as an architecture, and there's a lot of stuff around vector databases, and I guess Snowflake is trying to say they're a vector database too. But like that data that lives or gets funneled into vector databases has to be clean, has to be current, has to be transformed, has to come from somewhere.
I think a lot of times the answer to the question, how much can dbt and Fivetran and other companies in this ecosystem, how much can we help you, is often determined by how functional are the underlying platforms. I mean, in 2016, Redshift was pretty buggy. I mean, very frequently you would get weird compiler errors that there was no help on the internet. It kind of broke. And that's not true anymore. And the ways that the ways that AI functionality show up inside these platforms in kind of a native way, not in a bolted on way, is going to unlock. I mean, I hope that both Databricks and Snowflake and all the hyperscaler offerings are going to do a great job integrating AI, because then it means that it won't just be AI and ML engineers that have the ability to build these kinds of systems. Like, what we really want is we want these capabilities to be available to anybody who understands how to think about data.
We mentioned the semantic layer a few minutes ago. Just to walk us through some of the stuff like you guys have released in the last year, and maybe, if you will, like some of the upcoming stuff at dbt.
The big theme for us over the past year was we were starting to see companies deploying dbt at a scale and complexity that previously had not happened. And so they were starting to run into some really unpleasant experiences. They had a hard time. Here's a like really stupid one. DBT didn't make it easy to refactor a very large code base into multiple different projects or modules, and then integrate those using reliable APIs. And it didn't allow you to view that large, complex project in our kind of native visualization tool, which was called DBT Docs, because that was a single page web app, and too much information in there actually crashed your Chrome tab. So for the first time, we were like, oh my gosh, we have people that are really pushing the limits here. Let's see if we can solve some of that for them. And so part of that was making it more possible to refactor DBT projects, giving people a kind of first class tool that's to visualize DBT projects that scales as far as you want. But then the semantic layer was a big part of that too. One of the kind of, I don't know, Don Quixote style windmills inside of data forever has been that, you get to a meeting and somebody says revenue is this, and somebody else says no, revenue is this, and they're like, well, I'm using whatever. And so the conversation becomes about the numbers instead of the business. And this is fundamentally a problem of complexity. It's like too many disparate sources of truth. And the semantic layer, in the same way that like a cloud data platform centralizes data so you can all use the same data, the semantic layer centralizes meaning. How do you actually analyze that data to produce a particular business metric? And so that we are one of, there's a very small set of people trying to solve this problem. It is, how do you separate the semantic layer and the concepts defined in the semantic layer from the BI tool? Because historically, many BI tools have this kind of technology baked in, but you can only really use it inside of that BI tool. We're talking about
Like Looker and LookML, right?
Yeah, right. MicroStrategy way back in the day. But we were talking about AI. One of the most interesting uses of the semantic layer is that it presents a way to a roadmap to the AI to actually analyze the data in your database in a reliable, consistent way. So there's a lot of companies out there that are helping people do analytics on top of their data warehouse using AI, because AI can write SQL. But it turns out that that's kind of a probabilistic way to approach a problem that really should be deterministic. Like every time you ask, what's my customer count? You need to get frickin' exactly the same answer. And so the semantic layer injected into that AI pipeline can actually help you ask an English language question, compile it to the same SQL every single time.
Okay, that's the semantic layer. Like, what's coming up?
What's next?
Grand reveal of the roadmap.
Haha. There's a bunch. I named some of the AI functionality that we're looking into. We're also we've always cared about getting more humans involved in the process of analytics engineering, and there are certain humans that the way that they work with data is much more visually and not with code. And so this year will probably be the year where we start playing around in that space. Now, there are companies that have been doing that for 20 years, and we don't think that all at once we're going to just like make some better mousetrap. But we think that bringing the analytics engineering workflow to GUI-based workflows is I think a big unlock to lots of new people doing this stuff.
So we're talking no code, low code.
Yeah, it historically has been almost a religious topic in the DBT community, but I think the thing is like you have to get no code, low code experiences that read and write code, so that code can go through a get PR process and it can have all the same mature stuff built on top of it as any other code. There's other stuff, but those are some of the big things. I am very excited about our kind of nascent data catalog experience because I really care. Again, this democratization trend. I want everybody in an organization to just know what's out there, and then maybe using AI to be able to ask questions of it. And that shouldn't be a tremendously expensive thing. It should be kind of assumed that you have that kind of capability as a company if you've invested in creating these data sets in the first place.
Yeah. And not to belabor the point about the modern data stack, but like I think like this conversation, part of the conversation we just had, sort of reinforces the point that the companies are going to survive and thrive in this environment are gradually going to expand in terms of functionality, right? Like if you look at DBT, you sort of go into the BI world a little bit with a semantic layer, and then you sort of adding a data catalog layer, and bit by bit. And if you look at Fivetran, like I guess that's not new news, but they added real time to their catalogs. There's a lot of conversations around, okay, well, are the EL players going to also acquire the reverse, and there was reverse ETL players, and there was some of that. So anyway, maybe taking to close for the last few minutes of the conversation, maybe taking a step back and thinking through your entrepreneurial journey, your journey as a founder and CEO. One thing I read was that you've made some really key hires recently. You have a new CTO, a new president and COO, a new vice president of product. How did you think of navigating this transition of one team to the other, one senior layer to the other, and what have you learned over the years about hiring at different stages of the business?
It's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think that everything about being a founder is about context. It's about there's sometimes that you want to be patient, and then there's sometimes that you want to move very fast. And I think to the extent possible, you almost always want to be patient. And I think that was very, very successful for us for a very long time. We waited a long time to raise any venture funding at all. We had 1,000 companies using the product before we raised a single cent. And that gives you a ton of power and control. But with all of the market changes over the past, let's say 18 months, and with the very fast changes in scale of the business, it became very clear kind of very quickly that we needed people around the table that had a different set of experiences. And so if you look today, the only people who are consistent presence on our executive team from a year ago are me and our CFO. And everybody else around the table is new. And it's something I'm thinking a lot about right now. How do I, there's a lot of strengths that come with that. These folks know way more than I do about operating an at-scale business. I mean, every one of them has operated at larger scale than we're at now. And so then where are their weak spots? And how do I make sure to correct for those as much as I can? And I think a lot of that has to do with context. Like, they don't know our space that well. I mean, our team from a year ago, they lived and breathed our space. And we could, as a team, have incredibly deep conversations about this player or that player or the trends or whatever. But now that's not the case. And so I need to figure out how to download that content into everyone's brains as quickly as possible, because I didn't hire for that. That's not what I wanted. But I also need to take seriously that that's now a thing that's on me. Like, I've got to make sure that I'm adding that context. So I don't think that there's ever one right answer. Like, should you value this type of team or the other type of team? But we cared so much about operational maturity that I think this was the right call for us.
One really interesting thing that DBT has done very successfully is this transition from an open source, community-driven kind of project to a sustainable commercial venture. Any lessons learned there, especially on the cultural front? How do you go from one to the other without alienating your, rabidly enthusiastic open source community?
Oh, you waited until the very end to ask a very hard question. I don't know that there's a secret, but the best that I figured out is just be as transparent as you can be. This goes for like employees as well as external community members, because generally when you're an open source company, you hire a lot of people from your open source community, and then they really care. Like they care a lot. So in this transition, we've both had to have hard conversations internally. Like, hey, there's a set of things that we will need to charge for. And maybe that will mean some people aren't able to use it, but the alternative is we will not be a successful business and we will go away. Which is, it's kind of silly when you say it out loud. Like, of course that's true. But it's a hard transition for teams to go through. And then in the external community, it's, we've done some things over the past year. We've changed the way that we price, and anytime you change the kind of, not contract, but the agreement between you and a user community, it ruffles feathers, and it ruffled feathers when we changed pricing. And I have tried to do my best to communicate honestly and openly about that. And by and large, our business as a result has not really had a hiccup. But if you only existed on Twitter or LinkedIn, you would think that, our customers deserted us en masse, and every single one of them was livid and canceled. But that just didn't happen.
In a harder market like we have today, do you sell any differently than you did a couple of years ago?
Like we've gone through kind of command of the message type training, and our sales reps, we do much more deal inspection. But also we've had to do a lot more focus on pipeline generation. We have to be really serious about making sure that we know what our pipeline coverage looks like for next quarter, because 2 years ago we could walk into a quarter with 1x pipeline coverage, and the deals would just show up. And that's not how the world works today. And that's okay. That's not usually how the world works. It just means that we have to be better.
Tristan, thank you so much. Fantastic convo. Really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'll see you.